My name is Luke Nathan Phillips. You are listening to the Match My Mountains podcast. Here we talk about conservation, history, and their application to various other things in everyday life. We'll have some guests on here eventually to go talk about their adventures in the Great Western Mountains and the tiny dismal swamps, but that will be for sometime later. So, what I want to talk about today is a little bit of stuff about conservation history. If you go talk to people about what the history of conservation is, there is one through line stream that hits almost everything. And it's the idea that there is a difference between conservation and preservation. And in this framework, conservation is always framed as the wise use of resources, the greatest good for the greatest number. You do oil drilling here, and you build a dam there, and you let people ride on horses here, and you do it in a way that's sustainable. Then the theory of preservation is that nature is intrinsically good for its own sake, and you should preserve landscapes, habitats, wildlife, clean water, all that kind of thing, just because it's good, and not touch it with any kind of economic development, try to minimize the impact of recreation development, all that kind of stuff. Now, in practice, conservation and preservation are, number one, both more internally diverse than those frameworks would make them seem to be. And number two, they overlap more than a lot of people realize. There's always debates going on between different kind of outdoor recreationists about how certain parcels of land should be managed. One of the most notable ones is in American wilderness areas. There's always big fights all the time over just how many backpackers should be allowed into them, and also, notoriously, which regulations on backcountry etiquette should be enforced, notably whether you have to pack it in and pack it out. And pack it in, pack it out basically means you take a big sheet and you poop on it, and then you have to carry out your own human waste in your backpack. Which, by the way, is important. If you ever go climb the Whitney Portal Trail or go into the Olympic Mountains wilderness, do pack it in, pack it out, because when people don't, it's gross, and you have whole trails that smell like human waste for miles. It's disgusting. But yeah, so I'm getting off topic, but that's one of the debates that happens inside preservation studies, right? How much recreation should use. Another one is should you allow this invasive species or that invasive species to dominate for this time while you kill off the other one? And do you do it with this native species that might actually accidentally, temporarily overrun the ecosphere for the moment? Or do you do this particular kind of fuel thinning technique to stop forest fires from happening in the spot? Or do you let the forest fire rage through it, because that's how things happen for thousands of years before the foot of the white man ever touched these places? All kinds of debates. And all of these still count under preservation, right? We'll go more into that later. But then when you get to the conservation debates, it's also interesting. There are things that might ostensibly seem like preservation of nature that fit conservation goals as well. You all might have heard of the theme of ecosystem services. One of the most famous ecosystem services is the fact that forests keep water clean, right? So when you have a forest in a watershed, the water percolating from rainfall down through the trees, roots, and other stuff keeps the sources of drinking water for people in the surrounding communities all the way up to very far downstream safe for human consumption. In fact, that was one of the earliest conservation controversies. Adirondack Park in New York was set up in large part because people were worried about the pollution of the Hudson River from the industrialism of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And then beyond that, you have questions of how much should you harvest timber here versus oil there? Do you want to do timber farming in a way where you leave a couple trees up to seed the old area, or do you want to do clear cutting because clear cutting is more efficient and actually winds up making it easier to put on replantings and all that? That light that you just saw is a sign that everything I just said was completely correct. The divine will was endorsing it fully, and you should know that that doesn't happen very often, but when it does, I'm right about everything. Okay, so these are just a couple little things in conservation and preservation policy. That distinction is very, very important, okay? One of the things that you'll run into typically in environmental policy debates is the framework of a lot of environmentalists that you should just take nature and not touch it. You should not build any roads through it. You should not do any resource harvesting at all. You shouldn't even let hunters do their thing. It's pristine. It should just stay there. In the meantime, on the exact opposite side of that is the thing that caused conservation to be necessary in the first place, which is bald exploitation and destroy mountains so you can build border walls over them. Literally, there was an argument that you could prevent forest fires by cutting down all of the trees so there wouldn't be a forest to burn. Like literally back in the early days of the Forest Service, that was something the timber companies were doing. And it's insane. And also it's not in the interest of the timber companies because then you don't have any wood to cut 20 years from now, but I digress. So those are the kind of extreme poles. And then preservation and conservation are somewhat on the kind of middle side of it. These are really important debates. Most people are sane and aren't really on one of those sides. But the debates between different ways to frame it and different ways to like balance those competing goods in public lands and also just on any land management program in general are very important. And they are so important that they can create lots of controversies, including the kinds that we are presently facing in American government today. Sometimes you'll also hear about a secret third thing tradition in land management, which is recreation. I've thought about it, and it certainly is true that recreation is in tension in a lot of ways with a lot of preservation and a lot of conservation work. But when it boils down to it, if you look at recreation, or if you look at preservation and conservation as internally diverse and kind of multiple mixing things, recreation, every kind of outdoor recreation you can possibly do basically falls into one of those categories, and falls into like a kind of conversation in one of those categories. The argument that recreation has, or that people have conceptually about recreation, is fundamentally sound. It's that if conservation is about the economic use of resources and preservation is about the protection of nature for its own sake, then recreation is about the protection of nature for the sake of human betterment in non-economic ways. Functionally, that basically makes most recreation issues preservation issues. A couple of them are conservation oriented. Like if you want to build a ski resort, that's recreation and conservation. But I guess I'm saying all this to say, like, at the end of the day, it boils into those two. Now, there's another interesting thing here, too, that isn't often appreciated, but it complexifies and clarifies things at the same time. There's a couple historians. John D. Leshy is probably by far the most famous one and the most respectable one. And John Clayton, who wrote a book that was capable of being so good, and it just like tapered out towards the end. Like it was a unfortunately declining narrative quality the further you got into it. And it was unfortunate, but it also framed a similar kind of idea that the American tradition of conservation and preservation actually has been less of a debate and more of a kind of rolling consensus for the vast majority of American history. I'm not sure how much I entirely buy that. The fact that that argument can be made should just completely explode this idea that you see in so much public lands discourse nowadays that conservation, preservation is an either or. Like you can either go completely ham on blocking any kind of development whatsoever and freaking about every single thing in land policy. Those people are crazy, and we have to be able to let in all kinds of development no matter what, under all circumstances. Neither of those is particularly responsible. Neither of those is particularly realistic either. And there's some conceptual background that we can talk. At some point, I think we will get into that deeper. But what I want to do is make another argument about some of the other myths here. Most of the time when you talk about conservation studies, it will start up about maybe 1870 or so. In the Gilded Age, in the time when the big oil barons and the railroad oligarchs and all these guys were going and plundering American resources all over the place, most importantly in the West. Then a couple of brilliant genius guys like John Muir on the one hand and Gifford Pinchot on the other hand, it's always those two. Those are the two that everybody always brings up. Decided that we were going to stop this and spent most of their careers doing advocacy for the protection of public lands. And then eventually at some point after 1900, those paths diverged because John Muir was obsessed with keeping Yosemite pristine so that he could go write gospel narratives about it. And actually, John Muir's books are really, really good. Like, if you ever want to feel eccentric, then just go read about John Muir skipping through the valleys of Yosemite, climbing trees during windstorms to feel the experience, and calling various bears and elk and other stuff the children of God. It's pretty cool. I love My First Summer in the Sierra. It's a great book. So John Muir's preservation idea, and then Gifford Pinchot's I want to harvest 10% of every national forest every year for the next 1,000 years so that we can have a constantly growing and declining state of forestry that will create the greatest good for the greatest number. There's this idea that once we protected all the public lands, those two things diverged, and we have had the great rivalry between the national forests and the national parks ever since. That's the standard narrative. And that standard narrative also assumes that nature itself is the origin of our debates about nature. I actually think that that's not quite true. I think one of the reasons why the American public lands heritage and conservation tradition is as unique as it is in the history of the world, and you have other countries that have traditions in public land management that are quite different from the way we do it. You also have Native American tribes that have a very specific relationship to nature that is very distinct from the mainstream American understanding of nature and land management. I think the reason for that is that in American civilization itself, going at least to the early 19th century, and quite possibly earlier than that, there are two strands of a very complex American culture that has many, many strands, but these are two strands that start to form what eventually will become those two traditions, preservation and conservation. And those, that emerges itself, I guess, from the passions of the American Revolution and the ideologies of the Enlightenment and Puritanism and all that. All that's true. I don't doubt that, the errand into the wilderness and the last of the Mohicans and the George Washington desire to buy up as much land in the Ohio country as possible. I don't doubt that has any, that has a significant kind of thing to do with all of this. But for me, I think the time that all of this really starts in full is when explorers on the one hand and artists on the other hand go past the Appalachians, past the Mississippi River, past the 100th meridian in the middle of the Great Plains, and go start doing their thing in a place that they've never been before and try to look around. So there's a couple of books here that I brought in because they're fun and they've influenced me a lot. One of them is called Exploration and Empire by William H. Getzman. He has a son of a similar name who writes books that are nowhere near as interesting as this. Make sure you get the dad's book. But Exploration and Empire chronicles the development of the American explorer scientist tradition from Lewis and Clark, I guess all the way to the very dawn of the 20th century. There's some people after John Wesley Powell in this, but John Wesley Powell basically is the best person to stop. We'll talk about him in a second. So the explorer scientists, and I think the three great expeditions are Lewis and Clark on the one hand, John C. Fremont's tracking and, what's it called? When you take a map and you try to make a chart on a map. Surveying. John C. Fremont's surveying expeditions across the whole West in the late 1830s. No, all of them were the early 1840s, right before the Mexican War. Then John Wesley Powell's shooting down the Colorado River in it was the 1860s. It was the late 1860s. I forgot about that. It's the kind of thing that seems like it'd be later, but no, the Civil War was just barely over when he did that. Wow. Anyway, so John Wesley Powell's charting of the Colorado Plateau, and then plus at the same time there were a couple other surveyors employed by the federal government doing similar filler work. These guys came out west basically to figure out where everything was, to figure out where the resources were, to figure out what the most efficient and effective way to move thousands of human beings into fertile areas would be, and also just cutting out lines on a map so that you could figure out where the 160-acre parcels would be for settlers. That's what the explorer scientists did. It was not particularly romantic. It was not particularly like preservationist. It was explicitly about resource exploitation in the longer term. They weren't exploiting those while they were there, but they were setting the groundwork for it. And that tradition was happening for at least 70 years, and in some ways about 100 years before Gifford Pinchot ever had a wet dream about the Forest Service, you know? Sorry, that was crude of me. If you've had a wet dream about the Forest Service, I swear I'm not judging you. Anyway, okay, so you got your explorer scientists. I contend that they are the predecessors to the conservation movement that was explicitly about scientific management of natural resources in the 20th century, which we still have with us today. More on that in a second. The other tradition was when a very different group of people started crossing the Appalachians and the Mississippi and the 100th Meridian, going out west and just seeing things that were interesting that inspired them and made them feel about the smallness of man in the face of the universe, or whatever the kind of dumb thing you see in a lot of movies puts the framework on when somebody's looking at the stars. Which, by the way, I mean, for what it's worth, I do that myself sometimes. I just think it's cringe whenever you hear it said. So anyway, so there was a tradition of people going out west to do artistic stuff and to go paint pictures of Native Americans, go collect plants and bring them home and press them into their diaries, like a 13-year-old girl, probably a 9-year-old girl. Not that there's anything wrong with that, by the way. Like, I think plant diaries are pretty fun. I just haven't done it in a while. So, yeah. So you have a tradition of people going out west because they're inspired. And because when they're out there, they find a kind of oneness with nature is the wrong way to put it. It's more like there's this idea, right, that America is something distinct, something unique, just not the old world, right? The old world is civilized and decadent, and Europe and China and the Ottomans are places that are full of royalty and tyranny and Catholics. I'm Catholic, so this is always a tension between Catholicism and America, but that's an entirely other episode. So but meantime, in the New World, particularly when you have an individualistic, egalitarian, non-hierarchical Anglo-Protestantoid culture going and cutting down all the forests in Virginia and New England so that John Smith can become himself and John Winthrop can build a religious utopia that is not particularly nice to Quakers. That's this idea that the New World is a place where man is untainted by civilization. And so, like, a lot of the weird ideas about Native Americans that were held by the American country for most of the 19th and 20th century, and quite frankly, which in different ways people still hold today, is based on this kind of myth of the noble savage, right? The noble savage, the human being in the state of nature who is uncorrupted by civilization, and we Americans are also going out into nature, and we know just enough about civilization to be able to tame it, but we also to tame nature, but we also have this chance to start the world over again, as Thomas Paine puts it. And so when you have a bunch of dudes going out into the mountains and the plains and the deserts with that in their head, you get a lot of things, but a lot of it is great art. So this is a piece a book by a guy named, Roderick Nash? Yeah, Roderick Nash, called Wilderness in the American Mind. It's a dense book, but it's a great book. It chronicles the theory of wilderness and the ways that influenced American art and literature, and then in the longer run, American public policy towards nature, and particularly natural wilderness on the land. There's a couple people who feature pretty prominently, not just in this book, but in that history in general. One of the ones who's most important to think about actually is a guy named George Catlin. If you've been to any Smithsonian or opened up any AP US history book and ever seen those really, really nicely done but kind of archaic paintings of Plains Native Americans with their war bonnets and their lances, and they are standing nobly while being painted, those are most likely paintings by George Catlin. George Catlin was a guy from New England, I believe, who got really sick at one point, and his doctors told him that the arid climate of the westward lands would be a good thing for him to inhabit, because then it would give him an opportunity to spend more time in nature, and it would help his lungs. It's weird. That happens a weird number of times in 19th century medicine. There's probably something to it. It's just I don't really hear that as a diagnosis very much anymore. But yeah, so George Catlin went out there and was shocked and inspired by all the beautiful things he saw. So he painted all those pictures of Native Americans. He also kept a pretty intensive diary of stuff that he saw. And when he came back to the Eastern civilized world, wrote a bunch about it. I forget the name of the person who did this, but there was another guy who went on a shockingly similar journey to George Catlin's, who wrote a great book after that called The Oregon Trail. And The Oregon Trail was not a history of the settlers of the Oregon Trail. It was basically a memoir about going that far west and a chronicle of seeing what he saw. It's not the first in the great genre of adventure nature writing that is like quasi-romantic in the American tradition, but it's a really, really good example of that tradition. And so from that tradition sprouts then, remember, as the beginnings of what formed John Muir. And yeah, there's like Transcendentalism, and I've heard people say that East Coast Transcendentalism is basically all that you need to do to understand John Muir, except he did it out in the Yosemite Valley in the Sierra Nevada. That's fine, but I think it goes deeper than that. Like, Ralph Waldo Emerson went out to the Sierras to go hang out with John Muir. And when he was done, he was like, okay, John, this is nice and stuff, but you should really come back east. There's nothing out here. And Muir was just like so offended that he resolved to actually spend the rest of his life out in the Sierra Nevada. Not just the Sierra, but like spending time wandering around the Western Mountains, including Alaska. So anyway, so that's the thing, right? Is the preservation of nature started from this kind of like American romantic conception that the wilderness is a thing, and eventually, while you're out there long enough, you cease to have the kind of conquistador idea, and you start to have the dances with wolves idea that there's something out here that transforms the soul and is worth keeping for its own sake. And in one direction, that leads you kind of leftward towards a hippy-dippy, I love nature thing, and rightward it leads you to a this is America, rah, 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 I'm such a man thing, right? Both of which are basically essentially preservationist things that do not have any direct relationship to resource exploitation. So between those two things, the romantic tradition and the explorer tradition, I think you have the actual genuine roots of what then become preservationism and conservationism. These things go a lot deeper in American history than most people realize. And by the time you have John Muir and Gifford Pinchot battling it out in the newspapers over the fate of Hetch Hetchy Valley, which, rip in peace, got flooded so that San Francisco could have a supply of water that a lot of people said at that point it didn't need. I don't know. It would just be like shocking to see a debate in San Francisco today about whether they should dam Hetch Hetchy, but that's another story. San Francisco, if you look into the history, was like an incredibly reactionary and racist city all the way up through the 1910s and 20s. It's weird. That city changes itself over time. But it also is one of the most important cities for the history of American conservation, which we will talk about at some point. Anyway, I just talked then a little bit about what happened to the Hetch Hetchy Valley. And that, I think, is important because it goes and discusses, like, that story, that legacy itself is the time of a sort of permanent break, or rather a distinction between the preservationist tradition and the conservationist tradition in American public lands policy. So to roll back a little bit, John Wesley Powell, 1870s, winds up being the director of the U.S. Geological Survey, an institution that is still with us. It is currently getting ripped apart and bullied by the present administration, but that's okay because we're not talking about that now. We're talking about the 1870s. And the U.S. Geological Survey is often thought of as the first public lands agency in America. People who work for the Bureau of Land Management will strongly dispute that because the General Land Office had been around since like the 1810s or something like that. But the General Land Office, which in the 1950s turned into the BLM, didn't do anything resembling scientific management. It just kind of like handed out land grants to settlers who then either farmed it well or farmed it horribly and caused the Dust Bowl. But that is, again, another story for another time. The U.S. Geological Survey was the first of a bunch of agencies that was trying to manage how development in the West was going to go. It started to set up ideas on where the best mining areas were, where there was the most prospect for transportation corridors. And John Wesley Powell, the second director, actually wrote up some projects for how to better manage settlement in watersheds rather than on 160-acre plots of land, which, of course, nobody listened to him, and now we're stuck with the Colorado River Compact. But what that meant, though, was you did have people in the 1870s and 1880s starting to think again about the scientific management, the pragmatic use of the development of the resources of the West. And eventually that started leading to the folks in the Bureau of Reclamation who were building dams. It led to the setting aside of forest reserves, which actually initially were like designed kind of like the initial national parks. They were mostly to preserve the forest, but they also had a kind of partial management and contained logging kind of ethic to them too. It's complicated. Over the course of the 1880s, more forest reserves get set up. You start to have basic wildlife protections. You start to have attempts to manage mining in more complex ways, so that by 1901, when President Theodore Roosevelt raises his hand in Buffalo, New York, and takes the oath of office as the new president of the United States after the assassination of William McKinley, you have this kind of bustling group of different land management agencies, or like proto land management projects that then turn into agencies over the course of that time. In the meantime, in 1863, I think it's 62, as part of the general plan to try to help California support the Union War effort. It's weird. This literally happened in the context of the Civil War. None other than President Abraham Lincoln signs into law a thingamajigger going and granting California the use of the Yosemite Valley, provided that is always a public park for public recreation, right? Which again is why John Muir a little bit later goes and finds the Yosemite Valley in a really nice kind of form and goes and spends a lot of his life traipsing around the High Sierra there. So that was not the first national park. That was just a preserve that would later become a national park. But then in 1872, President Ulysses S. Grant, the hero of the Union in the Civil War, went and worked with George Bird Grinnell and a couple of others to sign the legislation turning Yellowstone into a national park into law. So actually, it's funny. There's a really, really like long-standing dispute that's mostly good faith now, but it wasn't always, between Yellowstone National Park and Yosemite National Park over which one was actually the first national park. We'll talk about that in a future episode as well, too. So you have national parks being set up as early as the 1860s. A couple more get set up over the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. The forest reserves start becoming quasi-national parks. But they're not really national parks. They're places that are meant for preservation, which is so interesting given like the tenor of the time, but also have a slightly bigger resource mandate than the other spots do. Enter President Theodore Roosevelt in 1901. He is influenced pretty strongly by Gifford, Pinchot more than anybody else on conservation policy, but he also goes camping with John Muir once and has a whole bunch of progressives in his administration who are very, very for wise resource use. He also is a kind of like manliness romantic about the American heritage and he wrote a whole series of books called The Winning of the West. He believes that there's something that makes like a country virile by like spending time in nature and all that. And so he becomes one of the great champions, not only of the preparedness movement, but of the National Fish and Wildlife Refuge system, in large part to be able to preserve wildlife populations so that people can hunt them and be in a sustainable way with them. Actually, that's a whole nother issue that we'll talk about at some point in the future as well, too, the North American model of wildlife management. All this to say, so President Theodore Roosevelt goes and founds several land agencies, right? The Bureau of Reclamation, the United States Forest Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, signs the Antiquities Act into law, goes and sets up a whole heck of a lot of national monuments that preserve areas for all time, right? And actually, to those national monuments are places that mean a lot to me. One of them is the Grand Canyon, and the other one, more importantly, is Olympic National Park, right? So Theodore Roosevelt has like a complicated legacy where he actually does more resource management stuff than most environmentalists like to remember. But he also does more genuine preservationist stuff than most natural resources harvesting people like to admit. It's a complicated legacy. But, given that he was probably one of the greatest balancer presidents in American history, which is ironic, given how like rambunctious and fiery his personal temperament was, Roosevelt kind of steered the early progressive conservation movement in a way that made it seem like conservation and preservation were not fundamentally at odds and actually were two sides of the same coin, part of this kind of great democratic project in managing the public domain that became a thing of myth over time. But during the Taft administration, which I think John Leshy is right here, was actually not quite as bad in land management policy as the great Gifford Pinchot propagandists like myself like to imagine it was. The Taft administration saw the genuine splitting off of those two things in ways in terms of how the national forest system started to be managed, but most importantly in that great fight over Hetch Hetchy. And Hetch Hetchy is a valley, again, in Yosemite National Park that's next to the Yosemite Valley. Great, beautiful spot. John Muir and the Sierra Club, which John Muir founded, and part of the reason it was founded was to protect Hetch Hetchy, fought long and hard to keep that place from being dammed. And eventually it was, and that was a great blow to the preservationists. But as often happens in land management, one great defeat became a great chance for the movement to regroup and reorganize and go fight a lot of great conservation or preservation crusades for much longer. And the Sierra Club, as you all know, is still with us. It's been around for over 100 years now, and it still does a lot of work. Some better than others, but it still does a lot of work. And then you hit, obviously, the First World War. Suddenly, conservation and resource management in, the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska and the mining lands of the West become all that more important too. One of the things that we haven't talked about a lot here yet is the National Park Service. Theodore Roosevelt never actually founded the National Park Service. Theodore Roosevelt is often remembered as the National Parks president. That is kind of a mischaracterization. He didn't do that much with the national parks. He founded 5 new ones, one of which was Crater Lake, which is a great park. But he didn't actually do as much with the parks as he did with the forests and the wildlife refuges. President Woodrow Wilson, who I really don't like for many, 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 many reasons, actually was the one who signed the Organic Act that created the National Park Service into law in 1916, right? And the National Park Service for the last 110 years has gone through many kind of reorganizations and changes of its purpose and mission. But back then it was mostly a kind of recreation-oriented spot that was trying to get people onto landscapes to go enjoy them and appreciate them in various ways. And it's about the 1910s and 1920s where you start to have this kind of creation of genuinely different preservation and conservation factions in American conservation policy start to really, really kind of become a thing. Now, over the course of the 20th century, those problems are still there. And by the 1970s, the rise of the environmentalist movement and the purging of moderates from the Republican Party, and thus the purging of a lot of conservationists from the Republican Party, goes and polarizes the conservation debate to ways that it really hasn't been since, honestly, at least the 1850s, which is weird to think about it. But there actually is, in that time, more of a consensus than most people realize. Everybody loves the national parks. Almost everybody loves the public lands. We have very important and usually good faith debates over how to, for example, manage the national forest. How much should be wilderness? How much should be open to logging and to grazing? How much should be plowed over for RV camps? How much should be dedicated to research? All of those are valid uses on that land. We have debates over how much national parks should focus on getting visitors there, which sometimes results in loving our parks to death, or how much national parks should be focused on conserving biodiversity and maintaining the pristine nature of these landscapes that we like. You also have all kinds of questions over how to maintain those landscapes. How much do you want to do tree planting and restoration? How much do you want to do active fire management? That's very controversial nowadays. How do you want to manage wolves and grizzly bears that do not know park boundaries and wind up going through the greater Yellowstone ecosystem in ways that a lot of locals have complicated feelings about? These are all things that happen on the public lands. But I think the important thing to always remember about them is that the traditions that they emerge from are not new, and they're also not just related to the land and the nature itself. They really genuinely are in the American identity and even the American soul, because the frameworks that they have, the romanticism, the pragmatic science, and the way that those encounter vast open spaces and turn into this great governmental project to try to make something genuinely new. They are America, just as much as anything in how we've thought about capitalism or social welfare or education is America too, you know? And that's one of the reasons that you should appreciate them and try to defend them and protect them as best as you can nowadays, because in failing to protect them, and I think sometimes even in failing to enjoy them, the public lands, you lose something of what it is to be an American. And I think here in the 250th anniversary of the United States of America, that's more important than it's ever been. Now, as we go further in this show, let me paint my full bias. I am probably the most preservationist of conservationists and the most conservationist of preservationists. Under current conditions, I definitely am getting into more wilderness warrior stuff. But even if that were to change under a kind of left-wing administration, I still would be a wilderness warrior and I still would be a public lands radical. And I am looking forward to talking to more of you who are on very, very different sides of this for the exact reason that I just mentioned about the different ways we use our lands, is because that is how American democracy is expressed in these lands, and I think in some ways is practiced there too. We'll go on some other tours in history. We'll probably also go on some other tours in some of the different parks. I'd like to figure out how to do that with you all soon. But in the meantime, I hope you all are enjoying the beautiful spring weather to go outside and take some time out there. And I will see you on the trail. May you never run out of mountains.